Welcome, everybody, to this week's edition of SafeDefend Live, joined again by Dr. V. What's up, bud?
How you doing, Phil? I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good. I've had a weird week. I've got a leg thing going on. In my youth, I was that guy like many of us. I never thought I was going to get old. I always thought I was going to heal and be able to do things like I did when I was 22.
Mm-hmm.
And guess what? I'm closer to 60 than I am 50. And I have officially realized that I should have listened to my dad and my uncles and my coaches and all my mentors. Said, man, why are you doing that? So I'm dealing with this old man. I'm in physical therapy for a leg thing right now. That's how bad it is.
Yeah, well, that's what happens. I feel for you. I'm kind of in that same spot.
Yeah, yeah. You
About
just kind of
year and a half away.
I was talking to an old service buddy of mine a couple weeks ago. Used to be our conversations about all the exciting, fun things we were doing in life. Now we talk about pains and sleeping and gosh, I can't do this and this hurts. And
Yeah, and how many times you go to the pharmacy? That's the biggest pain for me.
yeah,
Good
yeah.
Lord, every week it's like I'm picking up a medicine of some sort.
Well, I had a buddy say, "Man, you've really mellowed out, Nichols." And I said, "Well, I didn't really have a choice. I kind of had to." So no, but it's one of the joys of getting older. I always said that this proves the good Lord has a sense of humor. When you finally figure stuff out with your brain, your body's hurting. So,
Yeah, that's a fact.
well, hey, I had a lot of great feedback last week from our conversation, and if you would like, why don't we continue on about just we were talking about this before we came on. We want to always deliver content that is helpful to people, that when people are done listening or watching the replay, they say, hey, that prepares me as a teacher, a superintendent, an HR director, an employee, a parent, just so let's just continue down that path. You just sharing your lifetime of wisdom in this area.
Well, I think maybe something might be of interest to just kind of touch on today for a little bit, and we can, carry this on if we want. There's a lot to it, but I want to keep it just kind of real surface, just for a basic understanding, because I really don't, we can't get into a deep dive here, obviously.
Right.
But there's always this constant, question as why didn't we see this coming? Why did this happen? Why can't we stop these attacks? And so obviously we're talking about false negatives and false positives and problems that we're seeing with that. So,
Yeah.
so for example, a false negative is an example of that is when you do an assessment and you assume there's no problem, and then the attack happens, right? Or I'm sorry, I got that backwards. That's a false positive. So a false positive is you think the attack's gonna happen, and it doesn't. False negative is that you think it's not going to happen and it does, right? Easy way to do it, right? And so what boils down on that is a lot of times it's just some kind of a misunderstanding or misapplication of understanding analysis versus assessment and risk versus threat.
Okay. So for a teacher, right? Let's look at a teacher. What are some things they can do to make sure that doesn't happen, or to reduce the likelihood of those things happening?
Okay. Well, first off, it's first and foremost is that if it's that see something, say something thing, and I hate to go back to the old cliche, but it is true, right? If teachers know their kids the best,
Yep.
right, and they know when that kid is having a problem, when they're off, things like that, and so when they sense that, they should have a system in place to feel comfortable about reporting that. Now, it doesn't mean that they are necessarily going to decide whether it's, real or not, or if it's a real threat or not a threat or whatever. It's not their job to do that. But then first and foremost, just to report it. So that's number one, right? And that kind of gets down to, the difference between assessment and risk, right? Or analysis versus assessment, right? So assessment is something that we do when we have to make a judgment with not all the information, right? Which is like someone who is, planning on shooting up a school, for example, right? Because they got bullied, they can't take it anymore, and they're planning, right? So we're trying to stop that along the way through assessing their behavior, right? And then analysis is when you pretty much have got all the parts, like let's say after the fact, right? After the shooting, and somebody goes in and does kind of post-mortem analysis, right? And you look at the whole of the problem and you break it down, and then you try to figure out, okay, what are things we can do? Where's the vulnerabilities, right, in the building, right? Where's as far as our communication or whatever it is that they're looking down, you break it down. The difference is that you don't have the luxury of time during assessment, but you do during analysis. So that's number one, is just for that teacher, whoever it is, to report that concerning behavior, and don't worry about whether it really is or isn't, going to result in violence.
Well, one thing too that I think, I'm sitting here just thinking about, all teachers, to stay in the school system for a second, they're mandated reporters, right? So there are certain things that if they have concerns about or they see things, they're required by law to report those things to law enforcement or to their superior, so their superior can report it to law enforcement. But whatever way, it ultimately has to be reported, right? So so teachers are kind of used to being in that position already, right? What you described, they see something, it doesn't feel right. They don't have to personally go in and address it, but they need to get it in the right hands so that it is addressed, because, we hear a lot of people talk about, and this was something that was very difficult, Doc, for me to get my arms around when I first met Jeff Green, the founder of SafeDefend, and with Dan Cole, who's I think employee number 2 or 3 there, who I grew up with years ago, when they were explaining SafeDefend to me and how it worked. I'm going back 8-9 years ago. My first reaction was, well, put guns in schools. That was my first, because my background. I mean, that was, it's, well, good guy with guns better than bad guy with guns. That was the gut reaction, and we know that isn't the right approach, even though it's almost counter. I think most people sit down and they say, I'm talking about the parents sitting around the dinner table, or the people that when they see these shootings, they go, well, why don't they just put 5 or 6 people with guns in the schools? People don't even have to know they have them. And then when this happens, you've got good guy with gun that can end this thing. Well, in a perfect world, I guess that would work that way. But there's a couple flaws. Number one, teachers aren't law enforcement. They're not operators. That's not what they do. I'm not saying there's not people out there that wouldn't be willing, but people that are willing sometimes scare me because they're so willing. There's a lot of potential problems with that solution. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, there is. It's not really even about the gun or the tool, really,
right.
so much as the mindset that, we have to learn to try to get out of this, response
right.
mindset and get more into the proactive preventative mindset, right? Now, this doesn't negate the absolute need, right? That when it does go bad, you've got to have a response, right? Okay,
Right.
there's no doubt about that, right? And there's no doubt about that, you've got that, from the time the attack happens or starts to happen, you've got that critical gap, right? That you've got to be able to survive, right? And be able to eventually thrive, survive that, and deal with the new normal and move on, right? And still have a good life, right? So you have that, that response mentality, and that's what we're thinking about, with the gun and things like that, but more on the predictive side or the preventative side, that's really where the teachers, the coaches, the parents, even other kids, other peers, which is sometimes hard to get them to get past that. I know I'm a snitch type approach, and kind of changing that narrative to saying, look, it's not being a snitch, it's being helpful. You're helping someone who's in crisis, who needs help, right? There's nothing wrong with that. And so when I'm going back to this, the timeliness factor, right, or this hesitation to report behaviors, because you have so many. How many shootings have there been? How many attacks have happened where you go back afterwards and there were this indicator, this indicator, this indicator, this indicator, and no one, was able to put it, together in time to either prevent or at least mitigate the attack, mitigate some loss of life, right? Things like that, right? And that's the headspace we need to be in, because that actual headspace carries us into the actual response headspace, which is natural, right? Just kind of you kind of got an end-to-end solution here, right? Instead of just focusing on, oh my God, what do I do now? I hear a gunshot, and we kind of then ignore all the advantages and opportunities that we have to potentially get in front of that problem, right? Knowing that it's never going to be 100%, but it's certainly going to be a much higher percentage if we don't do anything.
Well, and I think too, you look at, Jeff and I, we spoke earlier this week, and we were discussing I think it's 26 or 28 or 29, whatever it is, $1 billion class action suit that was just filed against numerous entities and individuals down in Uvalde, Texas. There's the human side, which is most important, that we take care of trying to mitigate as much of the possibility of these things happening. Then there's the real world side also, from a legal perspective, that we just flat don't have the luxury of ignoring or not taking appropriate action these types of solutions. I mean, you just don't have that luxury. I mean,
that's a great point. In fact, I was just at a business meeting in San Diego over the weekend, right, for SafeDefend.
Right.
And I sat down and talked with at least, 10 or 12 superintendents, people that were in charge of security and things like this, who have an interest in what we do. And they're coming with the thought of, okay, we need to have something in place that's really reliable when the attack happens. And one of my questions to them is that what if you don't do your due diligence, be a good steward of safety and your funds and your position, right? What are you doing to reduce the risk, right? Or what are you doing to reduce the potential threat? And that's really what I'm talking about here, is that once the attack happens, it happens, and you're going to do what you're going to do, right? But you're looking at insurance, you're looking at liability, you're looking at lawsuits, and that is a very practical side. People don't want to talk about that, but that's a part of the equation, right?
There's a lot of these people that were named individually.
Right.
It's not just the entities, it's the individuals also.
Right. So if you've done your due diligence, right, to train the teachers to look for concerning behaviors, to give them training on what to do with that, have a threat assessment team or management team in place to deal with those threats, right? And you go through all those stages, that is considered very good due diligence, really, that will prevent a lot of these legal actions. And also show that, hey, look, we did what we could, and this is what we did.
Right.
And you can actually lay out those facts versus we did nothing until after people were dead.
Well, and I think I see a lot of this, and I'm not being critical of folks that have done this, because they're trying to do something, right? Mm-hmm. You'll see a lot of schools invest in cameras or these vestibules, where they're supposed to be secure, which, a guy with any kind of weapon can shoot his way through glass if they want to get in, or throw a chair through it, there's a lot of ways to penetrate, but a lot of, especially the cameras, right? What do cameras really do? Well, they're helpful with prosecution. They're helpful with debrief, but they do nothing to really protect by themselves. True?
Almost always. They're great. They're great to collect the visual imagery, right? The evidence, right, for prosecution afterwards, after the case is over with. The thing is these things happen so quick. I mean, the average shooting is over in 5 minutes.
Right.
And even if you looked at you were in your control room and you looked at the camera and you said, oh, there's a person with a gun. By the time you made a phone call, it's all over with, right? So I think a lot of this stuff, it gives everybody kind of a false sense of security in a way. I'm not taking away from the
No,
value of that in
right.
post response for certainly, right? And maybe to look at to learn something about the behavior of the shooters and things like this, by looking at post stuff, and that's all well and good. But see, there's a difference between your analysis and your assessment, right? If you have an analysis point of view, it's like, okay, we want to break it down. We got this whole, we got everything. We have time to break it down and analyze it, right? Because it's already happened. We have all the pieces, so to speak, right? But assessment, and especially, threat assessment, we don't have all the pieces. We don't even know if the person's going to be a problem, right? And so we've got to carefully, make informed judgments based on experience, knowledge, right, and authority and position and things like this, right, to have the best chance of interacting or engaging that student, right, who might be depressed, might be bullied or whatever, and try to stop it before it gets to that point to where the cameras are going to be helpful, right, meaning after the fact.
I hear things like, and I always look at this as a parent, right? What would I want to have? What would I want my school to look like if my kids were going into that building every day? So I'm going to ask you that question. I mean, if you could wave a magic wand and every school was going to do what you wanted them to do, what would be the first one or two things you would recommend people to do to start the process of creating the most safe environment you can for your kids and your teachers? What would those one or two things be to start with?
Well, I would do two major things on both ends of the spectrum, right? Right. So you're proactive versus reactive, right? Okay. First off, I'd have some sort of system in place for the inevitability, right? That something's going to happen, right? Because when it does happen, we want to make sure that that critical time is taken care of between the notification of the police and or the first responders, and then them actually responding, right? Because we can't stop all of them, so you've got to have an end-to-end system, and you got to kind of have elements of both in place, and then build from there, right? So you're going to need the response piece. There's no doubt about it, right? Because all the threat assessment in the world and all the other things like this isn't going to stop everything, and you got to have that in place. So my obviously my first suggestion would be get the SafeDefend system in for that inevitability, right, of when that happens, right? Okay, so you've got that in there for all the reasons that maybe we'll talk about in a different show, why that's a better system than most, right?
Right.
Why it works better, and it's superior, right? Okay, so that aside, right, now on kind of left of bang, right, the prevention piece, right, okay, have training for your people that interact with the students and who know the former students, right? Have a discussion, right? Have training, teach them what basic threat assessment is, give them the tools and the confidence to be able to identify concerning behaviors, right, and vet those behaviors, and then pass it off to people then who can then have the knowledge and the skills and the experience then to make a judgment on where those behaviors are in terms of imminent, immediate threat, no threat, probable threat, whatever it is like this, right? Because if you can get the information, the proper information reported, right? So that's training the teachers. And I don't just I focus on the teachers because they see the kids the most, right? But
Right.
I'm talking about having the same training separately for the parents, right? For the SROs, for the teachers, the coaches, and the peers, and anyone else in the student's life, right, who interacts with them on a normal basis, that knows kind of what they're about, knows them, right, and knows them in the world that they deal with them in, right, right, and have all those people be trained just to report it, have a place to report it, right, right, like a central place for it. It might be maybe the school counselor, right, or it might be some sort of, I don't know,
We have most high schools, for example, they have an assistant principal that's in charge of discipline. I mean, they're or the SRO or somebody,
sure,
but
yeah.
yeah, you got to have somebody.
Yeah, so you have a point of contact, right, where all these behaviors, these concerning behaviors, can be reported without judgment, right, on the part. Because I don't want the teacher to be saying, "Oh, that's probably nothing," and not report it, because that's what happens all the time, right? Later on,
Right.
we find out that that was because they only see a little, this much of the problem in the kid's life, right? They see this much, but the person that's taking in those observations, right, sees the bigger picture of all these data points, right? Okay, so that would be like number one, right? And if you just had that, right, and then we're able then to look at it from a standpoint of, okay, so what's our threat level here? What does it look like, right? Okay, and then pick the right thing. It might just be going up to the kid and sitting down and say, you know what, it seems like you're really having a bad time with Johnny, and I know
Yeah.
he's kind of he's been kind of he's kind of been aggressive towards you, things like that. What's going on, right? And engage that kid, because here's the deal: as long as you can stop the grievance along the pathway, then you essentially prevent the violence, and that's what we're trying
Right.
to do. And that would be some of the first steps. There's a lot more to it. I mean, we can you
Sure.
could add. I would suggest layers, like having the actual trained threat assessment team, right? And then we even getting off to the point where you can actually add software and tech and AI, and looking at social media, all the
Right.
stuff you can factor in as inputs, right? But the bottom line is that it's not about connecting the dots. It's about finding the right dots to connect, and that's the point.
Yeah, and I think we're going to put a bow on this today, but I think one thing I would say is you look at Uvalde because it's unfortunately in front of everybody for a lot of reasons. All that loss of life. There was so many. I mean, it literally was the thing that everything that could go wrong did go wrong, and it was just just a tragic situation all the way around. But I think that I think we build silos too, right? I think
Yeah.
we're really bad at saying, well, the school, we did this as a school, but the police department, even if you had a meeting, I've talked to people and they'll say, well, yeah, we had a meeting, we discussed it, they thought it was a good idea. Okay, well, that's confirmation that maybe what you're doing is a good idea, but that is communication. That's not training. That's not, okay, if when A happens, B is going to happen, C is going to happen, D is going to happen. This is how we're going to respond. And and then even if some people take those steps, Doc V, they then don't train to it. They don't practice it. They don't drill it. They don't,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean,
I
I
mean,
don't,
that's one problem, is that we have like you're saying, siloed, right? You get this siloed training, right? But then no one ever exercises that training and
yeah.
practices it in a role play or a scenario, even a tabletop.
I had my bride, who's a retired school teacher. She told me one day, she goes, well, listen, I became a teacher because I want to teach kids how to read, write, do arithmetic. And my answer to her was real simple. Well, honey, I hate it that this has became part of a teacher's life, but it has.
Yeah.
And we don't have to like it, but it's reality. And I think it's like so many other things that teachers get asked to do a lot of things. They wear a million hats today. It's not like when I was in school where Mrs. Mitchell or Mrs. Grundy or Mrs. Frazier or many of the great teachers that I had over the years could focus on just making sure we weren't stupid little knuckleheads and hopefully teach us in that 45 minutes to an hour they had us. They have to worry about so many other things. Because we don't like it doesn't mean that we have the luxury of not addressing it. And I think
Yeah.
that's the big thing for me is, nobody likes these things, but they're all stuff that we have to address and we have to deal with. So, well, Dr. V, I appreciate you very, very much. I look forward to next week and continuing our conversation about ways we can make schools, businesses, just everybody as safe as possible and have good sound training and systems in place to help with that. So appreciate it, brother. Have a great weekend. We'll talk to you next week.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dr. V.